As George Carlin said, governments and corporations don't want a well-informed population of citizens capable of critical thinking.
They want obedient workers. Obedient workers.
Johann Fichte, a proponent of the Prussian system, said that the higher classes constitute the mind of the single large whole of humanity. The lower classes constitute its limbs. The vast majority of people are not supposed to do any thinking. They're supposed to execute the demands of an elite minority. The masses must be dumbed down and told what to think. Fichte believed that education should completely destroy free will. He said that the schools must fashion the person and fashion him in such a way that he simply cannot will otherwise than what you wish him to will. Let's consider some other implications of our education system. Other than the minimal knowledge required to generate people who are just smart enough to run the machines and do the paperwork, as Carlin said, what little lessons can we expect the average child to acquire as they are being shipped along the educational production line? John Taylor Gatto listed 7. Number 1. Confusion. Throughout the school day, rather than tailoring to the needs of individuals, children will not have any control over the periods of time they spend on a given subject. This ensures that significant numbers of people will not be given adequate time to digest the information being transmitted to them at their own pace, helping to foster the creation of a bewildered herd with little to no idea of what the fuck is going on. Number 2. Indifference. The children will understand that what's called learning is about assuming the position of an empty receptacle into which unquestionable absolute truth is poured, and that this process can be turned on and off like a light switch, as well as merely being a means to achieving so-called good grades. The schools should generate indifference to anything that could remotely be described as real learning. The schools are factories for creating systemic ignorance. Number 3. Class position. Members of the working class should be well aware that the education system is not designed for them, but in fact serves the strategic and economic interests of corporate and state bureaucrats. As they are moved along the conveyor belt, the people should know their place and understand that it's there to provide an obedient workforce that can be disciplined and controlled by managers with a minimum amount of hassle. Number 4. Emotional dependency. The children should become emotionally dependent on so-called positive reinforcements, a term originally coined when training lab rats, I should note, such as a pat on the head, a smile, an A+, or any other kind of reward from above. In other words, doggy biscuit bribes to make children follow instructions. The reason for this is to train and socialize the children to embrace behaviorist methods of control. Techniques originally tested on animals to get children to stop doing what you don't want them to do and start doing what you do want them to do.
So the bird isn't acting independently. Its behavior is shaped by controlling its environment.
Number 5. Intellectual dependency. Children will be socialized to believe that authority is the ultimate source of unquestionable truth. Children are to be put into an atmosphere in which questioning authority is the worst thing you can do, even if the authority makes an incorrect statement. It's not about truth, it's about obedience, and truth is only valuable insofar as it fosters obedience. Indeed, a far better test of intellectual dependency is to get children to believe anything that an authority says, even if it's totally stupid. Number 6. Provisional self-esteem. Children will be constantly beaten over the head with the idea of so-called mutual respect. This gives the impression of a mutually beneficial situation, but in reality the idea of so-called mutual respect is basically a device used to explain to the children that they will be respected not in the Kantian sense of respecting them as human beings, but only insofar as they do what is asked of them and demonstrate obedience. Respect means that children must ask for permission to go to the toilet. It means veneration of authority and degradation of the individual. Number 7. The impossibility of hiding. Children are to be made to feel utterly powerless. Every single piece of work they produce and everything they do must be subjected to constant and systematic surveillance, examination and evaluation, while so-called progress must be logged in cumulative records. The fact that they are being watched all the time should help to make the children feel as small as possible and understand that their ultimate purpose in life is to assume the position of minuscule objects, to be placed under the absolute control of people with more power and status than them. By now it should be fairly apparent that the education system has very little at all to do with learning. It's about making children internalize authoritarian social norms and behavioral patterns and understand their position in the hierarchical society and training people to be mindless corporate slaves. It's about establishing to young children that there is a right way to do things and a wrong way to do things, and manufacturing a general culture of obedience and conformity. That's what the educational structure is for. The education system assumes this function because this is what best serves the interests of centralized concentrations of political and economic power. Any form of organization based on authoritarian institutions controlling the means of production requires the creation and maintenance of an obedient labor force that will spend their working lives taking orders from people. So why would education be structured in any other way? Education looks the way it does because the disgusting system we have requires it. From the very beginning, it was built by and for elites, not to benevolently provide people with knowledge. During its inception, many parents resisted compulsory schooling, sometimes even violently, because they had a very clear idea of what it was about. In Barnstable on Cape Cod, resistance was so strong that state militia had to be deployed to march the children into school. But not only is the format of education, that is, standardized testing for obedience and so on, structured for the benefit of economic elites, but for the past 30 years, the idea that education should even be provided as a public utility has come under attack, because the whole notion of pooling resources together to provide for needs is wrong, according to neoliberal doctrine. Larger numbers of people are getting into higher education over time, consequently undermining the possibility of it being reserved for a small academic elite. However, this does mean that individuals are under greater economic pressures to pursue higher education to improve their future prospects in the people market. To counteract this, further disciplinary measures are implemented in the form of tuition fee increases, massive tuition fee increases. This helps to either segregate higher education as being something reserved only for the wealthy, or, on the other hand, trap the vast majority of students into a system of perpetual debt that they will spend decades attempting to repay. People who go into higher education wanting to be artists, musicians, dancers, writers and philosophers end up finding themselves spending several years cooped up in a cubicle somewhere, toiling away and producing reports that nobody reads, dreaming about what it would be like to behave like a human being for once, although that possibility was taken care of a long, long time ago. Now they are subordinated to the consumer economy, and now they must spend all of their so-called free time miserably slumped on a sofa watching spirit-crushing corporate propaganda on a flickering television because their time on the hamster wheel has left them physically and emotionally destroyed. Meanwhile, the more successful members of the intelligentsia will go on and on and on about how this kind of heinous social damage can be repaired if only we just elected the correct people, got rid of the incorrect laws, and implemented the correct ones. And of course, if the public ever becomes so curious and so arrogant as to never find the humility to submit to a civil rule, if they ever have the audacity, the temerity to consider running their own lives for once, if they ever dare to cause a crisis of democracy, they must be subjected to constant, unrelenting ridicule and be beaten over the head with legitimizing myths, excuses for why the imprisonment of the population must be continued. It is when the population refuse to accept any more of these excuses that the social revolution begins.